Alright, we're picking back up on Chapter 4, Love in the Time of Cholera, top of page 180. Florentino Ariza continued to visit her in the looted house, whose furnishings were reduced to 3 leather stools that the thieves forgot in the kitchen, and the contents of the bedroom where the 2 of them had been. But he did not visit her as often as before, not because of the desolation in the house, as she supposed, as she said to him, but because of the novelty of a mule-drawn trolley at the turn of the new century, which proved to be a prodigious and original nest of free-flying little birds. He rode it 4 times a day, twice to go to the office, twice to return home, and sometimes when his reading was real, and most of the time when it was pretense, he would take the first steps at least toward a future tryst. Later, when Uncle Leo XII put at his disposal a carriage drawn by 2 little gray mules with golden trappings, just like the ones that belonged to President Rafael Nunez, he would long for those times on the trolley as the most fruitful of all his adventures in falconry. He was right. There is no worse enemy of secret love than the carriage waiting at the door. In fact, he almost always left it hidden at his house and made his hawkish rounds on foot, so that he would not leave wheel marks in the dust. That is why he evoked with such great nostalgia the old trolley, with its emaciated mules covered with sores, in which a sideways glance was all one needed to know where love was. However, in the midst of so many tender memories, he could not elude his recollection of a helpless little bird, whose name he never knew, and with whom he spent no more than half a frenetic night. But that had been enough to ruin the innocent rowdiness of carnival for him for the rest of his life. She had attracted his attention on the trolley for the fearlessness with which she traveled through the riotous public celebration. She could not have been more than 20 years old, and she did not seem to share the spirit of carnival unless she was disguised as an invalid. Her hair was very light, long, and straight, hanging loose over her shoulders, and she wore a tunic of plain unadorned linen. She was completely removed from the confusion of music in the streets. The handfuls of rice powder, the showers of aniline thrown at the passengers on the trolley, whose mules were whitened with cornstarch and wore flowered hats during those 3 days of madness. Taking advantage of the confusion, Florentino Ariza invited her to have ice with him, because he did not think he could ask for anything more. She looked at him without surprise. She said, "I am happy to accept, but I warn you that I am crazy." He laughed at her witticism and took her to see the parade of floats from the balcony of the ice cream shop. Then he put on a rented cape, and the 2 of them joined in the dancing in the plaza of the custom house, and enjoyed themselves like newborn sweethearts, for her indifference went to the opposite extreme in the uproar of the night. She danced like a professional. She was imaginative and daring in her revelry, and she had devastating charm. "You don't know the trouble you've gotten into with me," she shouted, laughing in the fever of carnival. "I'm a crazy woman from the insane asylum." For Florentino Ariza, that night was a return to the innocent unruliness of adolescence, when he had not yet been wounded by love. But he knew, more from hearsay than from personal experience, that such happiness could not last very long. And so, before the night began to denigrate, as it always did after prizes were distributed for the best costumes, he suggested to the girl that they go to the lighthouse to watch the sunrise. She accepted with pleasure, but she wanted to wait until after they had given out the prizes. Florentino Ariza was certain that the delay saved his life. In fact, the girl had indicated to him that they should leave for the lighthouse when she was seized by 2 guards and a nurse from Divine Shepherdess Asylum. They had been looking for her since her escape at 3 o'clock that afternoon. They and the entire police force. She had decapitated a guard and seriously wounded 2 others with a machete that she had snatched away from the gardener because she wanted to go dancing at Carnival. It had not occurred to anyone that she might be dancing in the streets. They thought she would be hiding in one of the many houses where they had searched even the cisterns. It was not easy to take her away. She defended herself with a pair of gardening shears that she had hidden in her bodice, and 6 men were needed to put her in the straitjacket, while the crowd jammed into the plaza of the custom house, applauded and whistled with glee, in the belief that the bloody capture was one of many carnival farces. Florentino Ariza was heartbroken, and beginning on Ash Wednesday, he would walk down Divine Shepherdess Street with a box of English chocolates for her. He would stand and look at the inmates, who shouted all kinds of profanities and compliments at him through the windows, and he would show them the box of chocolates in case luck would have it that she too might look out at him through the iron bars. But he never saw her. Months later, as he was getting off the mule-drawn trolley, a little girl walking with her father asked him for a piece of chocolate from the box he was carrying in his hand. Her father reprimanded her and begged Florentino Ariza's pardon, but he gave the whole box to the child, thinking that the action would redeem him from all bitterness, and he soothed the father with a pat on the back. "These were for a love that has gone all to hell," he said. As a kind of compassion from fate, it was also in the mule-drawn trolley that Florentino Ariza met Leona Cassiani, who was the true woman in his life, although neither of them ever knew it, and they never made love. He had sensed her before he saw her, as he was going home on the trolley at 5 o'clock. It was a tangible look that touched him as if it were a finger. He raised his eyes and saw her at the far end of the trolley, but standing out with great clarity from the other passengers. She did not look away. On the contrary, she continued to look at him with such boldness that he could not help thinking what he thought. Black, young, pretty, but a whore beyond the shadow of a doubt. He rejected her from his life because he could not conceive of anything more contemptible than paying for love. He had never done it. Florentino Ariza got off at the plaza of the carriages, which was the end of the line, hurried through the labyrinth of commerce because his mother was expecting him at 6, and when he emerged on the other side of the crowd, he heard the tapping heels of a loose woman on the paving stones and turned around so that he would be certain of what he already knew. It was she, dressed like the slave girls in engravings, with a skirt of veils that was raised in the gesture of a dancer. When he stepped over the puddles in the streets, a low-cut top that left her shoulders bare, a handful of colored necklaces, and a white turban. He knew them from the transient hotel. It often happened that at 6 in the afternoon they were still eating breakfast, and then all they could do was to use sex as if it were a bandit's knife and put it to your throat of the first man they passed on the street. Your prick or your life. As a final test, Florentino Ariza changed direction and went down the deserted oil lamp alley, and she followed, coming closer and closer to him. Then he stopped, turning around, blocked her way on the sidewalk, and leaned on his umbrella with both hands. She stood facing him. "You made a mistake, good-looking," he said. "I don't do that." "Of course you do," she said. "One can see it in your face." Florentino Ariza remembered a phrase from his childhood, something that the family doctor, his godfather, had said regarding his chronic constipation. "The world is divided into those who can shit and those who cannot." On the basis of this dogma, the doctor had elaborated an entire theory of character, which he considered more acute than astrology. But with what he had learned over the years, Florentino Ariza stated it another way. The world is divided into those who screw and those who do not. He distrusted those who did not. When they strayed from the straight and narrow, it was something so unusual for them that they bragged about love as if they had just invented it. For those who did it often, on the other hand, lived for that alone. They felt so good that their lips were sealed as if they were tombs, because they knew that their lives depended on their discretion. They never spoke of their exploits, they confided in no one, they feigned indifference to the point where they earned the reputation of being impotent or frigid, or above all, timid fairies, as in the case of Florentino Ariza. But they took pleasure in the air because the air protected them. They formed a secret society whose members recognized each other all over the world without need of a common language, which is why Florentino Ariza was not surprised by the girl's reply. She was one of them, and therefore she knew that he knew that she knew. It was the great mistake of his life, as his conscience was, to remind him every hour of every day until the final day of his life. What she wanted from him was not love, least of all love that was paid for, but a job, any kind of job, at any salary, in the river company of the Caribbean. Florentino Ariza felt so ashamed of his own conduct that he took her to the head of personnel, who gave her the lowest level job in the general section, which she performed with seriousness, modesty, and dedication for 3 years. Ever since its founding, the RCC had had its offices across the river dock, and it had nothing in common with the port for ocean liners on the opposite side of the bay, or with the market pier on Las Animas Bay. The building was of wood with a sloping tin roof, a single long balcony with columns at the front and windows covered with wire mesh on all four sides, through which one had complete views of the boats at the docks, as if they were paintings hanging on the wall. When the German founders built it, they painted the tin roof red and the wooden walls a brilliant white so that the building itself bore some resemblance to a riverboat. Later, it was painted all blue, and for the time that Florentino Ariza began to work for the company, it was a dusty shed of no definite color, and on the rusting roof there were patches of new tin plates over the original ones. Behind the building, in a gravel patio surrounded by chicken wire, stood two large warehouses of more recent construction, and at the back there was a closed sewer pipe, dirty and foul-smelling, where the refuse of half a century of river navigation lay rotting. The debris of historic boats from the early ones with a single smokestack, christened by Simon Bolivar, to some so recent that they had electric fans in the cabins. Most of them had been dismantled for materials to be used in building other boats, but many were in such good condition that it seemed possible to give them a coat of paint and launch them without frightening away the iguanas or disturbing the foliage of the large yellow flowers that made them even more nostalgic. The administrative section was on the upper floor of the building, in small but comfortable and well-appointed offices similar to the cabins on boats, for they had been built not by civil architects, but by naval engineers. At the end of the corridor, like any employee, Uncle Leo XII dispatched his business in an office similar to all the others, the one exception being that every morning he found a glass vase filled with sweet-smelling flowers on his desk. On the ground floor was the passenger section, with a waiting room that had rustic benches and a counter for selling tickets and handling baggage. Last of all was the confusing general section, its name alone suggesting the vagueness of its functions, where problems that had not been solved elsewhere in the company went to die an ignominious death. There sat Leona Cassiani, lost behind a student's desk, surrounded by corn stacked for shipping and unresolved papers on the day that Uncle Leo XII himself went to see what the devil he could think of to make the general section good for something. After 3 hours of questions, theoretical assumptions, and concrete evidence with all the employees in the middle of the room, he returned to his office tormented by the certainty that inside of a solution to so many problems, he had found just the opposite, new and different problems with no solution. Top of 185. The next day, when Florentino Ariza came into his office, he found a memorandum from Leona Cassiani with the request that he study it and then show it to his uncle if he thought it appropriate. She was the only one who had not said a word during the inspection the previous afternoon. She had remained silent in full awareness of the worth of her position as a charity employee. But in the memorandum, she noted that she had said nothing not because of negligence, but out of respect for the hierarchies in the section. It had an alarming simplicity. Uncle Leo XII had proposed a thorough reorganization, but Leona Cassiani did not agree for the simple reason that in reality the general section did not exist. It was the dumping ground for annoying but minor problems that the other sections wanted to get rid of. As a consequence, the solution was to eliminate the general section and return the problems to the sections where they had originated, to be solved there. Uncle Leo XII did not have the slightest idea who Leona Cassiani was, and he could not remember having seen anyone who could be Leona Cassiani at the meeting on the previous afternoon, but when he read the memorandum, he called her to his office and talked with her behind closed doors for 2 hours. They spoke about everything, in accordance with the method he used to learn about people. The memorandum showed simple common sense, and her suggestion, in fact, would produce the desired result. But Uncle Leo XII was not interested in that. He was interested in her. What most attracted his attention was that her only education after elementary school had been the school of millinery. Moreover, she was learning English at home using an accelerated method with no teacher, and for the past 3 months she had been taking evening classes in typing, a new kind of work with a wonderful future, as they used to say about the telegraph, and before that the steam engine. When she left the meeting, Uncle Leo XII had already begun to call her what he would always call her, my namesake, Leona. He had decided to eliminate, with the stroke of a pen, the troublesome section and distribute the problems so that they could be solved by the people who had created them, in accordance with Leona Cassiani's suggestion, and he created a new position for her, which had no title or specific duties, but in effect was his personal assistant. That afternoon, in the inglorious burial of the general section, Uncle Leo XII asked Florentino Ariza where he had found Leona Cassiani, and he answered with the truth. "Well then, go back to the trolley and bring me every girl like her that you find," his uncle said. "With 2 or 3 more, we'll salvage your galleon." Florentino Ariza took this as one of Uncle Leo XII's typical jokes, but the next day he found himself without the carriage that had been assigned to him 6 months earlier, and that was taken back now that he could continue to look for hidden talent on the trolleys. Leona Cassiani, for her part, soon overcame her initial scruples, and she revealed what she had kept hidden with so much astuteness during her first 3 years. In 3 more years, she had taken control of everything, and in the next 4, she stood on the threshold of the general secretaryship, but she refused to cross it because it was only 1 step below Florentino Ariza. Until then, she had taken orders from him, and she wanted to continue to do so, although the fact of the matter was that Florentino himself did not realize that he took orders from her. Indeed, he had done nothing more on the board of directors than follow her suggestions, which helped him to move up despite the traps set by his secret enemies. Leona Cassiani had a diabolical talent for handling secrets, and she always knew how to be where she had to be at the right time. She was dynamic and quiet with a wise sweetness, but when it was indispensable, she would, with sorrow in her heart, give free rein to a character of solid iron. However, she never did that for herself. Her only objective was to clear the ladder at any cost with blood if necessary, so that Florentino Ariza could move up to the position he had proposed for himself, without calculating his own strength very well. She would have done this in any event, of course, because she had an indomitable will to power. But the truth was, she did it consciously, out of simple gratitude. Her determination was so great that Florentino Ariza himself lost his way in her schemes, and on one unfortunate occasion he attempted to block her, thinking that she was trying to do the same to him. Leona Cassiani put him in his place. "Make no mistake," she said to him. "I will withdraw from all this whenever you wish, but think it over carefully." Florentino Ariza, who in fact had never thought about it then, as well as he could, and he surrendered his weapons. The truth is that in the midst of that sordid internecine battle, in a company in perpetual crisis, in the midst of his disasters as a tireless falconer, and the more and more uncertain dream of Fermina Daza, the impassive Florentino Ariza had not had a moment of inner peace as he confronted the fascinating spectacle of that fierce black woman smeared with shit and love in the fever of battle. Many times he regretted in secret that she had not been in fact what he thought she was on the afternoon when he met her, so that he could wipe his ass with his principles and make love to her even if it cost nuggets of shining gold. For Leona Cassiani was still the woman she had been that afternoon on the trolley, with the same clothes worthy of an impetuous bone, her necklaces, her rings with fake stones on every finger, a lioness in the streets. The years had changed her appearance very little, and that little became her very well. She moved in splendid maturity. Her feminine charms were even more exciting, and her ardent African body was becoming more compact. Florentino Ariza had made no propositions to her in 10 years, a hard penance for his original error, and she had helped him in everything except that. One night, when he had worked late, something he did often after his mother's death, Florentino Ariza was about to leave when he saw a light burning in Leona Cassiani's office. He opened the door without knocking, and there she was, alone at her desk, absorbed, serious, with the new eyeglasses that gave her an academic air. Florentino Ariza realized with joyful fear that the two of them were alone in the building. The piers were deserted, the city asleep, the night eternal over the dark sea, and the horn mournful on the ship that would not dock for another hour. Florentino Ariza leaned both hands on his umbrella, just as he had done in Oil Lamp Alley when he barred her way. Only now he did it to hide the trembling in his knees. "Tell me something, lion lady of my soul," he said. "When are we ever going to stop this?" She took off her glasses without surprise, with absolute self-control, and dazzled him with her solar laugh. It was the first time she used the familiar form of address with him. "I, Florentino Ariza," she said, "I've been sitting here for 10 years waiting for you to ask me that." It was too late. The opportunity had been there with her in the mule-drawn trolley. It had always been there with her there on the chair where she was sitting, but now it was gone forever. The truth was that after all the dirty tricks she had done for him, after so much sordidness endured for him, she had moved on in life and was far beyond his 20-year advantage in age. She had grown too old for him. She loved him so much that instead of deceiving him, she preferred to continue loving him, although she had let him know in a brutal manner. "No," she said to him, "I would feel as if I were going to bed with the son I never had." Florentino Ariza was left with the nagging suspicion that this was not her last word. He believed that when a woman says no, she is waiting to be urged before making her final decision, but with her he could not risk making the same mistake twice. He withdrew without protest, and even with a certain grace, which was not easy for him. From that night on, any cloud there might have been between them was dissipated without bitterness, and Florentino Ariza understood at last that it is possible to be a woman's friend and not to go to bed with her. Leona Cassiani was the only human being to whom Florentino Ariza was tempted to reveal the secret of Fermina Daza. The few people who had known were beginning to forget for reasons over which they had no control. 3 of them were, beyond the shadow of any doubt, in the grave: his mother, whose memory had been erased long before she died; Galla Placidia, who had died of old age in the service of one who had been like a daughter to her; and the unforgettable Escolastica Daza, the woman who had brought him the first love letter that he had ever received in his life, hidden in her prayer book, and who could not still be alive after so many years. Lorenzo Daza, no one knew if he was alive or dead, might have revealed the secret to Sister Franca de la Luz when he was trying to stop Fermina Daza's expulsion, but it was unlikely that it had gone any further. That left the 11 telegraph operators in Hildebrando Sanchez's province, who had handled telegrams with their complete names and exact addresses, and Hildebrando Sanchez herself, and her court of indomitable cousins. What Florentino Ariza did not know was that Dr. Juvenal Urbino should have been included on the list. Hildebrando Sanchez had revealed the secret to him during one of her many visits in the early years, but she did so in such a casual way and at such an inopportune moment that it did not go in one of Dr. Urbino's ears and out the other, as she thought. It did not go in at all. Hildebranda had mentioned Florentino Ariza as one of the secret poets who, in her opinion, might win the poetic festival. Dr. Urbino could not remember who he was, and she told him. She did not need to, but there was no hint of malice in it, that he was Fermina Daza's only sweetheart before she married. She told him, convinced that it had been something so innocent and ephemeral that, in fact, it was rather touching. Dr. Urbino replied without looking at her, "I did not know that fellow was a poet." And then he wiped him from his memory because, among other things, his profession had accustomed him to the ethical management of forgetfulness. Florentino Ariza observed that, with the exception of his mother, the keepers of the secret belonged to Fermina Daza's world. In his, he was alone with the crushing weight of a burden that he had often needed to share, but until then there had been no one worthy of so much trust. Leona Cassiani was the only one, and all he needed was the opportunity and the means. This was what he was thinking on this hot summer afternoon when Dr. Juvenal Urbino climbed the steep stairs of the RCC, passed on each step in order to survive the 3 o'clock heat, appeared in Florentino's office, panting and soaked with perspiration down to his trousers, and gasped with his last breath, "I believe a cyclone is coming." Florentino Ariza had seen him there many times, asking for Uncle Leo XII, but never until now had it seemed so clear to him that this uninvited guest had something to do with his life. This was during the time that Dr. Juvenal Urbino had overcome the pitfalls of his profession and was going from door to door, almost like a beggar, with his hat in his hand, asking for contributions to his artistic enterprises. Uncle Leo XII had always been one of his most faithful and generous contributors, but just at the moment he had begun his daily 10-minute siesta, sitting in the swivel chair at his desk, Florentino Ariza asked Dr. Juvenal Urbino to please wait in his office, which was next to Uncle Leo XII's, and in a certain sense served as his waiting room. Top of 190. They had seen each other on various occasions, but they had never before been face to face as they were now, and once again Florentino Ariza experienced the nausea of feeling himself inferior. The 10 minutes were an eternity, during which he stood up 3 times in the hope that his uncle had awakened early, and he drank an entire thermos of black coffee. Dr. Urbino refused to drink even a single cup. He said, "Coffee is poison," and he continued to chat about one thing and another and did not even care if anyone was listening to him. Florentino Ariza could not bear his natural distinction, the fluidity and precision of his words, his faint scent of camphor, his personal charm, the easy and elegant manner in which he made his most frivolous sentences seem essential only because he had said them. Then, without warning, the doctor changed the subject. "Do you like music?" He was taken by surprise. In reality, Florentino Ariza attended every concert and opera performed in the city, but he did not feel capable of engaging in a critical or well-informed discussion. He had a weakness for popular music, above all sentimental waltzes, whose similarity to the ones he had composed as an adolescent, or to his secret verses, could not be denied. He had only to hear them once, and then for nights on end there was no power in heaven or earth that could shake the melody out of his head. But that would not be a serious answer to a serious question put to him by a specialist. "I like Gardel," he said. Dr. Urbino understood. "I see," he said. "He is popular." And he slipped into a recounting of his many new projects which, as always, had to be realized without official backing. He called to his attention the disheartened inferiority of the performances that could be heard here now, compared with the splendid ones of the previous century. That was true. He had spent a year selling subscriptions to bring the Carto Casals Thibodeau trio to the dramatic theater, and there was no one in the government who even knew who they were, while this very month there were no seats left for the Ramon Caralt company that performed detective dramas for the operetta, and Zarzuela company of Don Manola de la Presa for the Santanelas. Ineffable mimics, illusionists, and artistes who could change their clothes on stage in the wink of an eye. For Denise Daltain, adventurer advertised as a former dancer with the Folies Bergère, and even for the abominable Ursus, a Basque madman who took on a fighting bull all by himself. There's a lot of hard names. There was no reason to complain, however, if the Europeans themselves were once again setting the bad example of a barbaric war, when we had begun to live in peace after 9 wars in half a century, which, if the truth were told, were all one war, always the same war. What most attracted Florentino Ariza's attention in that intriguing speech was the possibility of reviving the Poetic Festival, the most renowned and long-lasting of the enterprises that Dr. Juvenal Urbino had conceived in the past. He had to bite his tongue to keep from telling him that he had been an assiduous participant in the annual competition that had eventually interested famous poets, not only in the rest of the country but in other nations of the Caribbean as well. No sooner had the conversation begun than the hot, steamy air suddenly cooled, and a storm of crosswinds shook down the windows with great blasts, while the office groaned down to its foundations, like a sailing ship set adrift. Dr. Juvenal Urbino did not seem to notice. He made some casual reference to the lunatic cyclones of June, and then, out of the blue, he began to speak of his wife. He considered her not only his most enthusiastic collaborator, but the very soul of his endeavors. He said, "Without her, I would be nothing." Florentino Ariza listened to him, impassive, nodding his agreement with a slight motion of his head, not daring to say anything, for fear his voice would betray him. 2 or 3 sentences more, however, were enough to make him understand that Dr. Juvenal Urbino, in the midst of so many absorbing commitments, still had more than enough time to adore his wife almost as much as he did, and that truth stunned him. But he could not respond as he would have liked, because then his heart played one of those horse tricks that only hearts can play. It revealed to him that he and this man, whom he had always considered his personal enemy, were victims of the same fate, and shared the hazards of a common passion. They were 2 animals yoked together. For the first time in the interminable 27 years that he had been waiting, Florentino Ariza could not endure the pangs of grief at the thought of this admirable man would have to die in order for him to be happy. The The cyclone passed by at last, but in 15 minutes its gusting northwest winds had devastated the neighborhoods by the swamps and caused severe damage in half the city. Dr. Juvenal Urbino, gratified once again by the generosity of Uncle Leo XII, did not wait for the weather to clear, and without thinking he accepted the umbrella that Florentino Ariza lent him for walking to his carriage. But he did not mind. On the contrary, he was happy thinking about what Fermina Daza would think when she learned who the owner of the umbrella was. He was still troubled by the unsettling interview when Leona Cassiani came into his office, and this seemed to him a unique opportunity to stop beating about the bush and to reveal his secret, as if he were squeezing a boil that would not leave him in peace. It was now or never. He began by asking her what she thought of Dr. Juvenal Urbino. She answered almost without thinking. He is a man who does many things, too many perhaps, but I believe that no one knows what he thinks. Then she reflected, shredding the eraser on a pencil with her long, sharp, black woman's teeth, and at last she shrugged her shoulders to put an end to the matter that did not concern her. That may be the reason he does so many things, she said, so that he will not have to think. Florentino Ariza tried to keep her with him. What hurts me is that he has to die, he said. Everybody has to die, she said. Yes, he said, but he more than anyone else. She understood none of it. She shrugged her shoulders again without speaking and left. Then Florentino Ariza knew that some night, sometime in the future, in a joyous bed with Fermina Daza, he was going to tell her that he had not revealed the secret of his love, not even to the one person who had earned the right to know it. No, he would never reveal it, not even to Leona Cassiani, not because he did not want to open the chest where he had kept it so carefully hidden for half his life, but because he realized only then that he had lost the key. That, however, was not the most staggering event of the afternoon. He still had the nostalgic memory of his youth, his vivid recollection of the poetic festival whose thunder sounded throughout the Antilles every April 15th. He was always one of the protagonists, but always, and in almost everything he did, a secret protagonist. He had participated several times since the inaugural competition, and he had never received even honorable mention. But that did not matter to him, for he did compete not out of ambition for the prize, but because the contest held an additional attraction for him. In the first session, Fermina Daza had opened the sealed envelopes and announced the names of the winner, and then it was established that she would continue to do so in the years that followed. Hidden in the darkness of an orchestra seat, a fresh camellia in the buttonhole of his lapel, throbbing with the strength of his desire, Florentino Ariza saw Fermina Daza open the 3 sealed envelopes on the stage of the Old National Theater on the night of the first festival. He asked himself what was going to happen in her heart when she discovered that he was the winner of the Golden Orchid. He was certain she would recognize his handwriting, and that then she would evoke the afternoons of embroidery under the almond trees in the little park, the scent of faded gardenias in his letters, the private waltz of the crowned goddess at the wind-blown daybreak. It did not happen. Even worse, the Golden Orchid, the most sought-after prize among the nation's poets, was awarded to a Chinese immigrant. The public scandal provoked by that unheard-of decision threw doubts on the seriousness of the competition. But the decision was correct, and the unanimity of the judges had its justification in the excellence of the sonnet. No one believed that the author was the Chinese who received the prize. At the end of the last century, fleeing the scourge of yellow fever that devastated Panama during the construction of the railroad between the 2 oceans, he had arrived along with many others who stayed there until they died, living in Chinese, reproducing in Chinese, and looking so much alike that no one could tell one from the other. This is weird. At first, there were no more than 10, some of them with their wives and children and edible dogs. Ugh. But in a few years, 4 narrow streets in the slums along the port were overflowing with other unexpected Chinese who came into the country without leaving a trace in the custom records. Some of the young ones turned into venerable patriarchs who, with so much haste that no one could explain how they had time to grow old, with so much haste, no one could explain how they had time to grow old. In the popular view, they were divided into 2 kinds, bad Chinese and good Chinese. The bad ones were those in lugubrious restaurants along the waterfront, where one was as likely to eat the king as to die of a sudden death at the table, sitting before a plate of rat meat with sunflowers, and which were thought to be nothing more than fronts for white slavery and many other kinds of traffic. The good ones were the Chinese in the laundries, heirs of a sacred knowledge, who returned one's shirts cleaner than new, with collars and cuffs like recently ironed communion wafers. The man who defeated 72 well-prepared rivals in the poetic festival was one of these good Chinese. When a bewildered Firmina Daza read out the name, no one understood it, not only because it was an unusual name, but because no one knew for certain that what Chinese were called. But it was not necessary to think about it very much, because the victorious Chinese walked from the back of the theater with that celestial smile Chinese wear when they come home early. He had been so sure of victory that he had put on a yellow silk robe appropriate to the rites of spring in order to accept the prize. He received the 18-karat golden orchid and kissed it with joy in the midst of the thundering jeers of the incredulous. He did not react. He waited in the middle of the stage as imperturbable as the apostle of a divine providence less dramatic than ours, and as soon as it was quiet, he read the winning poem. No one understood him, but when the new round of jeers and whistles was over, an impassive Firmina Daza read it again in her hoarse, suggestive voice, and amazement reigned after the first line. It was a perfect sonnet in the purest Parnassian tradition, and through it there wafted a breath of inspiration that revealed the involvement of a master hand. The only possible explanation was that one of the great poets had devised the joke in order to ridicule the poetic festival, and that the Chinese had been a party to it and was determined to keep the secret until the day he died. The Commercial Daily, our traditional newspaper, tried to save our civic honor with an erudite and rather confused essay concerning the antiquity and cultural influence of the Chinese in the Caribbean, and the right they had earned to participate in poetic festivals. The author of the essay did not doubt that the writer of the sonnet was, in fact, who he said he was, and he defended him in a straightforward manner, beginning with the title itself, All Chinese Are Poets. The instigators of the plot, if there was one, rotted in their graves along with the secret. For his part, the Chinese, who had one died without confession at an oriental age, and was buried with the golden orchid in his coffin, but also with the bitterness of never having achieved the only thing he wanted in life, which was recognition as a poet. On his death, the press recalled the forgotten incident of the poetic festival and reprinted the sonnet with a modernist vignette of fleshy maidens and gold cornucopias, and the guardian angels of poetry took advantage of the opportunity to clarify matters. The sonnet seemed so bad to the younger generation that no one could doubt any longer that it had, in fact, been composed by the dead Chinese. I'm going to stop there. This was written in copyrighted 1998. So there's a little, 1988, I believe. So the language is a little dated.